one of the greatest scholars in the history of Beowulf studies, and quite possibly the most interesting man in the world. I actually think Tom is a contender for that title.
And you can stop laughing, Newton, for a start.
And I think it's true, though. I think most people here would agree. That's probably why most of you are here, is because Tom really is a captivating person, one of a kind. Once he's gone, there's no replacement. All right. One question to begin with. Why study Beowulf? So, an observation. I've heard it said that more has been written about Beowulf than about almost any other work of English literature. Follow that observation with a question. Why have some scholars, such as Tom Shippey and myself, written so much about Beowulf? That's actually a question worth asking. I think that if there was some 19th century novel that people kept writing about as much as we write about Beowulf, they would be viewed as very peculiar. And so I think the question of why do some people spend decades writing study after study about Beowulf is a question worth answering, and it's one that we intend to address here. A second question, is there anything more that can actually be said about Beowulf, anything new to say about Beowulf? And our answer to that question is yes, and we're going to give an example from a forthcoming paper. Tom's articles go back to 1969, which, Tom, I guess you wrote this when you were 25?
Well, let's think. It came out in January 69. I think I must have sent it in 68. So actually, I was probably 24. 24 coming up 25.
24-year-old Tom Shippey was basically like John Keats. He was great from the beginning. As we're going to see when we actually look at this article today, I think there's still a lot of insights in that article that have yet to be fully digested into Beowulf studies. I just put up my most recent one on analogs in Middle High German, paper on Beowulf and the Nibelungenlied, paper on the earlier written copies of Beowulf, the archetype of Beowulf. Why do people write so much about Beowulf over and over again? Well, Beowulf is connected to several significant textual corpora, and within these corpora, it's one of the major works. So within the corpus of Old English poetry, it constitutes 1/10 of the corpus, and it's really the most substantial poem of all the Old English poems. You have a corpus of Old Norse saga literature with these so-called two-troll narratives, of which there are dozens. And Beowulf, again, is the earliest and most extensive in that corpus. You've got sources for Germanic myth and legend, where, again, Beowulf is the most significant vernacular source in this department, rivaling perhaps, things like the Poetic Edda. Sources for early medieval history, which shine a light on Beowulf, as Tom's most recent monograph shows. And then within the context of Indo-European studies, Beowulf has a significant place alongside the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Mahabharata, and others. There are numerous sub-disciplines, ancillary disciplines of medieval studies that really acquire a lot of meaning and significance in the context of Beowulf studies. Okay. A little timeline about Beowulf, just to orient us. We have one manuscript produced by two people from around the year 1000, dated through its handwriting. The poem itself is, however, significantly older. The one extant manuscript contains many errors, indicating that it's a copy of a copy. These are errors from the eye, not the ear. And so they basically demonstrate that the date of the manuscript is irrelevant for the question of the date of composition. And the date of composition is best determined through the language of the poem itself, which places it perhaps as early as around 700. That you have this folkloric plot. A Geatish hero kills two monsters in Denmark. He returns home, becomes king of Geatland, and dies while slaying a dragon. The first part of the poem especially is connected to the folktale type 301, known today as the Three Stolen Princesses, but better known in the context of Beowulf studies as the Bear's Son folktale. You have, in addition to that, the extensive digressions that refer to moments of legendary or potentially real history concerning the Danes, the Geats, the Swedes, Frisians, Franks, Wolfings, etc. You have a very salient Christian element with biblical allusions. You have the characters of the poem represented as intuitive monotheists. And you have, of course, things like gnomic passages concerning the omnipotence of God and whatnot. And then you have also this dynastic drama element, as Francis Lenehan calls it in his very insightful recent monograph, where you have the subplots of Danish and Geatish succession. You have courtly speeches, aristocratic rituals, and an emphasis on all other ancillary aspects of aristocratic life, with treasure, for instance, being a prominent feature.
I think I've written about this 3 times and come up with a different answer every time, which rather can be explained away by what Len's just said. It is a stratified poem, and it depends which stratum you're particularly interested in. There's the fairy tale stratum, there's the historical stratum, or the allegedly historical stratum, and there's also, in a way, the kind of zigzag pattern of the poem itself, which is really, very obvious. We have 3 big fights. Everybody knows that. We have a wind-up to the first fight. We have an interlude between 1 and 2. We have an interlude between 2 and 3, though perhaps you could call that 2 interludes, because one is kind of finishing the Danish section and the other is starting the Swedish section. Then we have the third fight, and then we have a wind down, a long wind down. So that's either, it's kind of peaks and troughs all the way. And they're either 7 or 8 sections, depending on how you take the one in the middle. And that's quite clear, I think. The question is, what's the purpose of it? And in a way, that I don't think we have a definitive answer to that. And that's one of the things we don't know about Beowulf. We can only have theories about it. What was the point of creating it like this? Tolkien did address this question in his 1936 article, which everybody remembers, but I'm not sure. I don't think anybody's been very convinced by it, except Tolkien fans. So I think we could think rather more about that, perhaps.
From the year 1000, roughly. This is a picture of the first page of the manuscript and the last page of the manuscript. And it's instructive, actually, to look at the first and last page, because you can immediately see several things about the manuscript. You can tell, for instance, that we have 2 scribes who have different handwriting, very notably different handwriting. And you can also see that, unfortunately, we are dealing with a manuscript that has experienced quite a bit of damage. Here you have just a sample that I picked really at random to illustrate the distinct handwriting of the 2 scribes. And I just picked this because these were 2 very clear passages. And so what I want to do now is actually just show you sort of how do we get this Beowulf from the manuscript to the edition that you're all reading when you read the Beowulf that Tom and I have put out, or any Beowulf edition. Notice many things are different, actually, from the manuscript to an edition. For one, you don't have capital letters in the manuscript exactly as we have them. You do have some capitals, but you don't have them corresponding to where we put capitals in modern English. It's also the case, you might notice that there is some dotting in the manuscript, a kind of punctuation that it has, and it's been argued that there's a systematic, rational character to the placement of these points in the manuscript. However, they don't correspond at all to how punctuation is used today in English. So the punctuation in any modern edition is going to be editorial. And that might lead you to think, well, then it's all illegitimate. Anything editorial is illegitimate. But the point I want to make is that essentially you can't really read Beowulf without editorial intervention. It's a necessary thing to produce a plausible reading experience and actually to recover the real or a more accurate text of Beowulf than the one that two manual laborers happen to have transmitted, because that's what the scribes are. I mean, they're not necessarily people who comprehended what they were transcribing, and there's a lot of signs of that in the manuscript. So if you look at this Old English passage and you look at ours, perhaps one of the most salient differences is that the Old English text in the manuscript is just written out as if it were prose, not as if it were poetry, not as if it had line divisions or verse divisions, with the space between the verses being what we call a caesura. None of that is in the manuscript. So you might reasonably ask, sort of, how do you take the text on these 4 lines and then get the text that comes out in our edition in these 4 lines? And you might reasonably ask something like, how do you know the word shall at the end of the 2nd line belongs there and not in the beginning of the 3rd line, where you can see the 3rd line has alliteration on the SC consonant cluster? Well, we know this because of Old English meter. Edward Siefers, at the end of the 19th century, identified that Old English meter basically consisted of 5 metrical types, which are known as types A, B, C, D, and E, along with various licensed exceptions to those types. And that there were other rules that explained the apparently unpredictable fluctuation of syllables between verses and lines. The essence of Siversian metrics could be boiled down into these items that are in the last line here. The verses that are on the previous slide, they basically fit perfectly into these 5 metrical types. And there's no other way to divide the words without rendering the lines unmetrical. So you get a sense that actually the lineation in our edition, and in all modern editions essentially follows this, must be correct, because if there were any modification to it, it would produce unmetrical verses that don't follow these 5 types. And Beowulf is extremely regular in its adherence to the 5 types. With regard to meter, there's just a brief digression I'll add here, which is that because we have this extreme regularity of the meter, the meter can tell us various things about the language of the Beowulf poet, as opposed to the language of the individuals who were transcribing the text in the year 1000. So, for example, when the text of Beowulf is fully divided up into half lines and lines, we encounter verses like On Fled Gath, which apparently consists of only 3 metrical positions, but it occurs, the same verse actually occurs twice, and so we know there's not a random error here. The reason for it is that the word goth appears to require its pre-contracted form and to actually be a form like gaeth, and thereby providing the verse with an additional metrical position. The same kind of thing is in the verse Hean Huses. And conversely, there are verses like Tharwas Halatha Hlaktr, where the manuscript spells Hlaktor as if it was, this process known as parasiting had occurred, and it were disyllabic. But the meter indicates that actually this is a monosyllabic word. And it appears that this process took place in the 7th century. And so essentially the Beowulf poet is using very old forms of some of these words like Hlaktur and Wundur, where he's treating them as monosyllables, even though in written Old English and late Old English, they were written as if they were disyllabic. And there's a very complex phenomenon known as Kalutza's law, which has been used to date the poem very early. And it's all about the way that meter indicates how the poet treated certain syllables differently. And so the source you would want to turn to, it's admittedly, it's a formidable source and a dense one, is R.D. Folk's book, A History of Old English Meter, and all of the articles that have emerged in subsequent decades addressing topics. But Folk is really the master of this subject.
Okay, well, here's the Old English. Where the Mathaloda there on Widgesat ombecht unfrocht. Equathras shall sharp shildwiga yeshad witan wada on worka say there well fincheth. Okay, and my translation is the Coast Guard spoke, a fearless officer, as he sat there upon his steed. A shield warrior with his wits about him must know how to decide from deeds or from words.
Passage, and the point you make, if I were to fill it out for you, is that the literal meaning, or possibly is something like has to know the difference between words and deeds, as Chickering has it. But your point is, any idiot knows the difference between words and deeds, right? That the meaning has to be something like know how to judge from on the basis of either words or deeds. Is that the essence of your interpretation?
Yes, that's right. It struck me as soon as I read the Chickering translation that that doesn't really make sense. It's an Old English proverb as well, to say that deeds speak louder than words, or we would say actions speak louder than words. But that's something which is very generally shared. So you don't have to be very bright to work that out. No, in any case, you have to remember the context. This has got to make sense in context. And the context, of course, is that the Coast Guard has got to make his mind up. But he's got to make his mind up on inadequate evidence, because he has no evidence about deeds at all. All he's heard is what Beowulf just said. So what he must be saying, in a way, is that I'm going to have to make my mind up on the basis of what I hear. And in fact, he then says, it's that you hear. And hear, of course, means hear, but the y in front of it is a perfective. And I think what it means is this is what I have heard. And it's also, in a way, a decision. I have heard, and that is why I'm going on to say the next thing I'm going to say. So I think all that makes perfectly good sense. It makes sense in context. The difficult word is yeshad and its various analogues, but they all have something to do with, as we say, we both agree, distinction, discrimination, but also the result of distinction and discrimination, which is decision. But it's all got that sense of, a kind of chop in it. Well, I think actually, as a general comment, not meant to anyone in particular, though I know who I'm thinking about, gnomic passages in Beowulf have given translators a lot of trouble, because gnomic passages are always elliptical. Well, not always, but they're often elliptical or metaphorical. And you have to not only know what the words mean, you have to know what the overall sense is. And that is often obscure. But of course, obscurity may well be part of the charm of it all. You are expressing your own wisdom and testing the hearer's wisdom as well. So we have to consider the context of gnomic sayings, both in the poem and, on some occasions, if we have other evidence, outside the poem. But that is a part of the rhetoric of Beowulf, and indeed of Old English poetry. Okay, well, we might consider gnomicism later, but that's what I would say about this bit.
Well, I think the great thing to take away from the whole segment on this text is that you can see how many forms of knowledge are required, essentially, to get us Beowulf from the one manuscript we have to this point where Tom is translating it and really getting at what it means.